Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
Yeah, we're still here with Aaron Sherwood. We're going to continue our trek through Galatians. We have recorded a couple episodes already with him with the introduction episode and then almost pretty much chapters 1 through 2 last time. And so we're going to pick up with chapter 2, verse 17. And so, Aaron, we're glad you're back. Thanks for coming to join us again.
Thank you for continuing to invite me. I'm happy to keep doing this.
Yeah. And Nate, good to hear you. You've been remarkably quiet throughout this series.
Well, I missed last time, so yeah, it's good to be back.
Glad to have you back.
Well, yeah, last time I think I recorded with you. I could barely speak because I had just come from the dentist.
Well, that's right. So hopefully this time it's a little easier to talk.
Yes,
no longer mush mouth.
So. No, it was pretty comical.
Especially as you got to explain the fun topic of the history of dispensationalism with a numbed tongue.
I've always wanted to do that. And
I think everybody who's ever explained the history of dispensationalism has done it with a numbed tongue.
Well, there we go. That's a record. All right. So far throughout the book of Galatians, we've seen in chapter 1 how Paul, he opens up with this greeting and then launches right into a curse formula where he normally gives a thanksgiving to churches. So he's doing it to highlight the severity of the issue going on in Galatia. There are some people who are coming into the church in Galatia and telling them they need to adhere to the Torah, to certain legal requirements within Judaism. And so what they're saying is they need gospel plus. They're changing the implications of what Christ did in the gospel, saying that what he did was not enough for them to attain righteousness and salvation and so on. They're not changing the actual truth of what gets you saved in the gospel, but rather they are, again, changing what you need to continue being saved as part of Christ's community. And Paul breaks into this analogous story of Peter whenever he began to adhere to the requirements of the Torah and of the Judaic law at that point and begin to break fellowship with Gentiles and also lead them down a path to think that they were no longer part of the believing community if they did not follow the same demands. Paul uses that story in order to begin his argumentation, showing the dangers of what they are doing and show the solution to the problem. So that brings us to chapter 2, verse 17. If you want some more details, go back and listen to the previous episodes. But we will pick up with chapter 2, verse 17.
Right, and I think we probably were talking at the end of the last episode about how the way that Paul's talking to Peter kind of flows into how he's talking to the Galatians. And you can't actually tell. I mean, English translations have to put in paragraph breaks and quotation marks, but you can't actually tell when Paul starts talking to the Galatians. And so around 2:18, the rest of that little paragraph for chapter 2, Paul says, the people that Peter is feeling pressured by, kind of similar to the people that the Galatians are feeling pressured by, saying, now that you're a Christian, or to continue to live as a Christian, you've got to add this pre-Jesus aspect of Judaism into living as a Christian. Their rationale would be something like, it's great that you've become a Christian, but now we don't want to transgress Torah. And Paul says in about 2:18, actually, if I build that up again, then I am transgressing Torah, right? He says, ironically, they have it exactly backwards. So that's where he starts flowing into talking to the Galatians, saying, if you pull a Peter here, Galatians, then you aren't going to be avoiding transgressing Torah like the agitators who want to reintroduce some Torah observance. You're going to be following them into fully opposing God's program for the kingdom people.
Yeah, and there's a distinction that I wanted to draw here that I feel like would be helpful, and there was some hesitancy for myself to say Torah in the beginning because of the fact, what do we make of the Torah that these Judaizers are propagating and teaching versus the Torah that Jesus has not nullified and that Paul says is good elsewhere? Is there a difference in the maybe type of Torah that they are teaching or in exactly what they're teaching?
Well, you're stealing a bit of Paul's thunder, because if we fast forward to about chapter 5, verse 13, Paul says, if you live out love, then you are fully realizing Torah. So Paul's saying there's Torah observance as, part of your piety. That's one thing. And then there's actually realizing Torah that Jesus would affirm. And Paul is going to go that direction and say, we're giving away part of his argument here, but he's going to contrast his position with the agitators, say, Galatians, you should be on my side, because which one of these two camps is really able to actually live out Torah? Well, it's the people who are the Spirit people. So that's not what Paul's talking about here in 2:18 through 21. He's definitely talking about, he's definitely talking about the personal piety aspect of this is now part of living the Christian life.
Right. It's kind of like the difference between the extra rules that maybe the Pharisees were pushing that were part of, Torah plus for them, whereas Jesus says, like, I'm not here to abolish the Torah, but then he takes the implications of the Torah and pushes them further on the Sermon on the Mount. But that is not exactly the type of Torah that Paul is talking about as being good. He's rather saying that these observances that are not rooted and founded in love and faith are what are the problem.
That's right. In a few, paragraphs here, Paul's going to start talking about trust and faith. And the issue is going to be, of course, is your relationship with God found in trusting Jesus? And if so, doesn't that mean that you are going to be living out the ongoing Christian life in terms of it being a relationship, and that relationship is how you identify yourself as being a Jesus person? In contrast to the agitators saying, oh no, the way that you identify yourself as a Jesus person is by practicing this, this, and this.
Right. No, I think that's helpful, because I feel like I can see a lot of people reading this and saying, how can Paul be a transgressor by rebuilding Torah if Jesus never abolished Torah? Well, that's your answer, because there's a difference between strict legal Torah observance and living out the implications of Torah through love.
Yeah, that's a great clarification to pause and make. Thanks.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you too about verse 20, where it says, I have been crucified with Christ. And this may have some implications for sanctification and what we think about that, just because it's all in the past tense. And so do you see this as relating at all to our sanctification as being made holy? And does it have any bearing on whether or not that is a process versus a more or less one and done action?
In the way that you're asking, in the very, very broad sense, of course it has an implication. Like being sanctified and being saved are all events on the same long spectrum of relationship with God and Jesus. But Paul isn't really talking about sanctification here. We want to go to other places like, stuff in 1 Corinthians or Romans or Philippians to talk about, what does it look like to be really transformed from being a pre-Jesus person to a now Jesus person? Paul is talking in shorthand here because his emphasis isn't to pause and digress into sanctification. His emphasis is to say, this is who I am fundamentally. I'm a Jesus person. I am somebody who has sort of gotten out of the way, and now who I am, Paul, is no longer really who I am. Who I am is a little walking around Jesus clone. And that happened because, I was crucified with Christ, which has all sorts of sanctification implications, but I'm not going to go into that right now.
Right. So his point here is not to maybe add to his theology of sanctification, but just rather make the point that what Jesus did for me was in the past, and so I am now part of him.
Right. I guess if there would be a sanctification element or angle here, it would be talking about how what Jesus did for you in the past, it's meant that you've turned a transformational corner. There is some fundamental spiritual change of your identity and your basic makeup when you enter into a relationship with God. When you're reconciled to God as a human being who formerly was, alienated from God, that marks a transformational moment in your basic identity and direction in life. And so the past tense, I was crucified, there in verse 20, might be pointing to that transformational dimension.
Right. No, that's good. So I do have a couple questions as we continue on through chapter 3. But at this point, why don't you go ahead and just give us, again, just what we've been doing most, I think, so far on this Galatians series. Give us the broad landscape of what is Paul doing in the next section ahead as we come out of chapter 2 into chapter 3.
Okay. Well, if we're right, as we were talking about before, if we're saying that sort of 110 through 420 is the first argument or the first half of the long argument, the storytelling, the story hour that we've gotten in chapters 1 and 2 has now come into the actual, I'm arguing style of format talking starting in chapter 3. So maybe you could say the argument part of it goes from 3:1 to 4:20.
The part that we like to think about as the argument.
Yeah, where we go, this is actually, him saying like declarative sentences and drawing out reasoned connections and finding the rationale between things. Argument, That
Right.
really starts from 3:1 to 4:20. And The first little paragraph, I think we should linger on in a second here. So I'll skip over it, except for to say it sort of sets up that whole section where he says, okay, this is the basic thesis I'm going to be laying out and why I'm mad at you. Because he starts out, oh, you foolish Galatians, which we'll talk about in a second. So then as it goes through the rest of chapter 3 and the first 20 verses of chapter 4, Paul's first main thing that he hits on in this argument is, okay, well, who are Abraham's heirs? So he's really responding to the agenda set up by the agitators. It's not like he walks around going through the Mediterranean world lecturing people on who Abraham's heirs are. They've disputed it, so he's got to respond to their disputed claims.
Right. And the whole background of this conversation is a very specific occasional event.
That's right.
Not something we need to like try to necessarily build a theology out of this as who is Abraham's heirs and not, because it's really a tangential analogous issue that Paul is using, again, to address specific issues they brought up and to make analogies that will prove points in this argument.
That's right. And so in, I guess it would be 3:7-ish through, I'd say towards the end of chapter 3, Paul's point is going to be Abraham's heirs aren't just the people who got saved like Abraham. Abraham's heirs and continue to live like Abraham's heirs are the people who got saved like Abraham did. They're not just replicating a salvation conversion moment. They're replicating an entire identity and relationship and ongoing lifestyle. And he's going to set that record straight for the rest of chapter 3. And then he's going to have a couple conclusions in the first 2 chunks of chapter 4 is where we're going. I think there's some important things internally to the letter that we should point out. And I also think that there's some cool things that we can extract for 21st century application that are worth pointing out. So in 2 pieces there. In terms of what's going on inside the letter, Paul starts off with this really wonderful, harsh language. He's got some other stuff in chapter 5 that's really harsh. He's really spicy in Galatians. It's really entertaining. If you do a dramatic reading of it, I can imagine it being very lively.
I think this may be the only letter where he says anathema, right?
Yeah, he says it a couple times, and then, give me a sec.
And he also tells his opponents to emasculate themselves, which I don't recall reading anywhere else.
So I got it here.
So spicy is a good way to say it.
And then again, in about 5:12, I think a good translation would be, I wish these agitators of yours would go all the way, and that the knife would slip, and they would cut it all the way off. And that's pretty graphic for it to be in a New Testament letter. But Paul's not afraid to go there.
Yeah, I feel like I usually don't pick that up in my translation.
It's there.
Which I can see that. I mean, if you go and compare maybe some more Jewish translations to say the ESV and like Ezekiel 16, it's going to sound a little different.
Yeah, that's right. Well, in 3:1-6, he starts off yelling, "You mindless Galatians!" And I don't want to like give feedback here on the microphone, but he's hollering at him, calling him, brain dead. You brain dead Galatians. What is wrong with you? Hello, knock, knock, anybody there? That kind of a thing. Then he launches.
He's really laying it on with like, why are you so foolish? Why are you so foolish? Who's bewitched you? Like something's wrong here. Like something's wrong with your head.
That's right. And it demands to be yelled out loud if you're to do a dramatic reading of it, right? And Paul's point in here is showing how dumb the rationale is. Okay, the agitators say, you got saved. Great. Now you've got to be a Christian the way that we're going to prescribe to you so that you can work your way up gradually to achieving a higher level of spirituality and maybe achieve spiritual gifts or something like that. And they've already got it. That's the problem. They, before the agitators got there, were already past where the agitators thought they wanted to bring them to. So Paul says in 3:1-6, how come you've already got the Spirit, you're already living Christian lives in relationship with Jesus, and the power of the Spirit is in your midst, and you've seen all these things, all these experiences that you can testify to. How come you're going to arrest that, go backwards, and try and get back to it by a different route than actually got you here? Why would you exchange spirit for flesh, and why would you go backwards and try to get to spirit by flesh when you're already at spirit? So that's the kind of approach that Paul is taking in
right. He's kind of getting you out of the airport and off the plane and putting you on roller skates to get across the country.
Yes, right.
And so I wonder here with the strong language, I feel like I see 2 aspects of what's of something to say about Paul's strong language here. Because, to my remembrance, he may be similarly strong in Corinthians, but he's exceptionally passionate and angry, and some might even say insulting here. And so whenever serious missteps happen, theologically, or at least maybe people are, well, I guess that's part of the issue, is if there are people who are leading people astray, it seems that he is willing to use stronger language to show how terrible what they're doing is and how idiotic it is to believe what they're doing. And so there may be, I want to say on the one hand, I want to think through maybe the pastoral application of this, because on the one hand, it's interesting that this person that we think should be so soft, he's an apostle, and so he shouldn't ever be angry. And so why is Paul behaving this way? On the flip side, I feel like this may give some justification, wrongly give justification to kind of that cage stage person who just wants to go out and Bible bash everyone who doesn't agree with their theological particularities. I can see this being taken implicitly in both ways. Do you, either of you guys have any thoughts or comments on Paul's outbursts here?
I want to hear Nate's ideas on the pastoral implications before I start to
Okay, Caleb, help me understand your question again.
Yeah, so Paul, he's kind of insulting these Galatians. And so when, as a pastor, do you start insulting your congregants? And how is this not a justification for kind of that cage stage, like let's just fight over every single theological particularity because, I've got to be the hero here. Have you ever asked anyone if they were bewitched when they said something wrong to you?
No. I think if I'm in Paul's shoes and I'm writing a letter from a distance, it might be a little bit easier to have this kind of language. I wonder if Paul would use the same language if he was face to face with them. But Paul's passion for the gospel is clear here. And I think as a pastor, if there are people who are infiltrating the flock and potentially drawing them away from the truth, it does need to be met with a certain force. And I think this does speak to that.
Do you think the same should apply for poor teachers who are outside of the church? Just say, we've touched on things before, like the prosperity gospel. We don't have in our congregation any prosperity gospel teachers that I am aware of. And so should we resort to insulting those who are teaching that and believing it? Because I'm wondering if the reason Paul's language is so strong here is because this is imminent to the congregation. He needs to show the stupidity of what's going on here very practically, very forcefully, because it affects this situation, not a distant situation.
Right. Well, and he doesn't even call the agitators, like he doesn't say that they're the ones that are bewitched. He's talking to the congregation, it looks
right.
Why are you believing them? You fools. I think there is a benefit in speaking pastorally to your congregation about the false teaching that is outside the church. Especially, there's so many ideas out there that are readily available nowadays because of the internet or social media. And so I think we are wise to speak to those things. I don't know that it's super helpful to call them names or even call them bewitched, but I do think there is wisdom in at least speaking to it.
Yeah, so it seems to me like there may be places to apply strong language like this, but do it very carefully and don't assume that the first place that you see bad theology, it's time to go. It may be something very, I think in my mind, and I'd like to see if both of you agree, that since this is so deeply rooted in this congregation, he needs to show them that he thinks this is just outright stupid. If it were off in the distance, he may just warn.
Yeah, I can remember, this is several years ago, but we had a member, and this is before you, Caleb, but we had a member who was pretty harsh with another member about a theological issue that they saw in the other person's life. And it really, the person he was talking to, he really didn't know very well, and he was a younger Christian, and really the lack of tact was really bad and offended this young believer. And I had a conversation with the one who was being so harsh, and his argument was Galatians, and specifically Paul confronts Peter, and he says, "I'm just being like Paul." Yeah, so I think you're right, Caleb. I think we've got to take into account the very specific situation that's going on here, and not just apply it to every other situation.
Yeah, maybe the publicness also matters as well. This is not an intimate situation. This is out and about in public, and so there needs to be some, I mean, and two, in this culture, shame was not purely evil like it is in our culture. It was a useful tool at times.
Mm-hmm.
And it still should be today it isn't today in some ways. It's also very misused, but, to publicly shame something is to say, this community does not align with that idea. And so by him stepping outside of the bounds of the gospel, he's publicly saying, like, that is outside the community bounds. And so therefore you're stepping out of it. And you need to know that. And everyone who is viewing needs to know that.
I think everything you guys have said sounds wise and smart. I'd just add to it, somebody who says, well, I'm just being like Paul, you can kind of look at him and say, well, do you have Paul's credentials? Like, do you have the wherewithal and the right to be like Paul? Because in this letter alone, he spent a chapter and a half describing how Jesus met him personally, gave him a personal revelation, elevated him to being one of the apostles, which was officially recognized by the apostles as being an independent confirmation of, okay, when you have all those things, come talk to me about using the same kind of rhetoric that Paul uses with this group of people that he's got very, very close ties and intimate relationship with.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I told this guy. Are you an apostle?
Yeah.
Right. All right. So let's jump back in here to Galatians.
All right. Well, I had two worthwhile points to make about 3:1-6, and then we can keep going. First of all, for the first century context, it's kind of the same point, the 2 points I want to make. For the first century context, Paul does not say, well, here, let me give you superior theology, and that's why you should believe my position instead of the agitator's position. Paul doesn't go to theology. Paul goes to reality. He goes to empirical history. He goes to factual experience. So there's nothing theoretical or abstract or framework about this. This is Paul pointing out, those agitators can't put up their ideas versus the experienced history that you've got. So that's an interesting dynamic Paul's going to go on to expand in the next couple paragraphs in chapter 3. And I think the 21st century application is the difference between Christianity and every other or every world religion, if you don't even want to call Christianity quite a religion. I mean, Paul's not doing comparative theology here. He's not putting Christianity up against Hinduism or Buddhism or even Judaism. Paul's just explaining why the Galatians should do what they should do. In the process, though, he happens to mention this important connection to reality and history, which shows that fundamentally Christianity is not like a world religion in the sense that it's a belief framework that explains things that you can subscribe to. Christianity is it's something that actually happened in history and now is experienced in real life, empirical history for people who are living as Christians in relationship with God and Jesus. And so there's lots of theology to get right. That's important. Right. But you don't start from theology and extrapolate your way towards a relationship with God. You start with a relationship with God, and it empowers and transforms a person. And then theology comes afterwards. And that's the difference between Christianity and what you would call a religion out there in the world for the 21st century context that you see here in 3:1-6.
It seems like such a strong theme throughout all of Paul's letters. I mean, just to boil it down, it really strikes the difference you're getting at is that Paul is just harping on unity and loyalty to the King who gives acceptance into his kingdom by grace, by favor. And that's, again, much, much different than just subscribing to any deity which will give you some blessing at the time because you have just done the right things, which was a lot of the culture within this Greco-Roman context. This is a covenantal family, not more so a local deity to barter with.
Right. And also not just a belief system.
Right. Yeah, much more than that, but is actually building a kingdom, and he's trying to show you functionally, as we're loyal to King Jesus, how do we make his kingdom what he wants it to be?